and we're going to be talking about the essential work they are doing to help Ukrainian children who have been displaced and have found refuge in Poland. It's a very interesting topic. I'd like to introduce Magdalena Wojciechowska, President of the Association Your Place. Magda, thank you so much for helping us to understand the great work that you're doing in Poland for Ukrainian refugees.
Dziękuję również bardzo.
Thank you very much. Likewise, thank you very much for inviting me to this program.
So tell us a little bit about the work that you do and the people that you serve, as well as your team. How do you assemble that team? Give us an understanding of the great things that you are doing to help these Ukrainian children.
Nasze stowarzyszenie powstało w...
Our association is not a very old one because we were only established in March 2021. But for about half a year before that date, we started thinking together how we could put our skills to a better use, how we could put them together, because we had quite a range of skills and specializations. In many cases, there are persons with a dozen years of experience and more. And we wanted to provide, to launch an organization that could provide comprehensive help. Plus, if there were areas or persons that we couldn't help because we were missing a certain specialization, we would be able then to refer them further.
So you have a team of people who have psychological training and educational training. And you started off, I guess, as volunteers. Is that correct?
Tak, każdy z nas.
Well, up until now, most of us are continuing to work for their normal place of employment, whether it be a school or a school for special needs children. But together we form quite a community, because typically there are many children that are often referred from one person to another. If there's a person that needs some additional service from a qualified teacher, educator, then a psychologist will send them on, and the other way around, a teacher can refer a child for psychological help. So up until now, we've been working pro bono for the association, but the idea is that we would like to shift our efforts full-time to work for the association.
Well, our compliments, because this idea of just responding to need, it's something that we need in this world. And you are embodying that value through your work. And of course, to sustain it, you need to figure out a way to pay for time so that everybody can put bread on their own plate as well through these activities. But the response is just amazing. So our compliments. So you have these refugees who are coming over, people who are displaced. You have a lot of children coming over. You're responding to those needs. But in the world today, we also see a response to refugees, which is very negative in different countries. We have seen in Hungary, and even before this war in Poland, this fear of refugees. How do you process this? Because Poland has basically absorbed 10% of its population, and it's a huge burden. How is Poland not responding negatively and seem to be responding in such a productive and positive sense, even though there is such a flood and such stress on the country?
Ja myślę, że to jest dlatego.
I think this is a bit of our national character, that we tend to have this emotional reaction to people in need. So it usually takes up very quick what was happening, and so it's like a reflex of a kind heart. The response which is happening, which is still happening, although a little less now, is simply just the reaction to people in need. Also, it was such a sudden situation that nobody expected, hence this sudden reaction to it.
Could you talk a little bit about the services that you provide and the dimension of the services? How many children are educated in Poland, were educated in Poland before? this rush of refugees, and what is the challenge right now?
Te liczby są bardzo duże.
The hard data that we have at the moment is that there were 7,000 Ukrainian children who took the 8th grader exam, which is like the final exam at the end of the elementary school. Basically, there are hundreds of thousands of children which are in one way or another included in the Polish educational systems, but we don't know the exact figures. There are statistics, but we have to remember that there's some part of the children that are included formally but are not using that system, the educational system. But also there are some children that are using the daily support system but are not part of the educational system. All we know is that they constitute a very big fraction of the children and young people who use the educational system.
You know, it's amazing. 2.8 million children have been displaced. Some of them are displaced internally in Ukraine. Some are displaced externally, and you are absorbing so many people. And you're also dealing with people who have a different experience than those that you've treated before. How are the differences becoming obvious between a child who is displaced from their homeland or who has perhaps witnessed war and the children that you treated previously?
To jest tak, że praca z takimi
that work is very difficult. One of the first things is the language barrier. Even if we know some Russians or maybe a little bit of Ukrainian, this is difficult because when we deal, for instance, with psychological assistance, we're really talking in very abstract terms. For instance, psychologists talk about emotions and about feelings. Even in one's mother language, it's very difficult to talk about. The second thing is that there are significant differences in the educational systems, for instance, in the syllabus. Also, there is this. You can compare it to a situation. So, a child that suddenly ends up in an entirely different educational system can be compared to an adult who's thrown into a new job where they don't know the language, they can't read the instruction manual, they don't know what's going to happen, they don't know how things work. This is very stressful. Basically, if the Ukrainian child comes to a class which did not have any issues before, usually the adaptation is actually quite quick, relatively quick. When there is a class or a group that has had some difficulties in the past, let's say there are children, one or more children with learning disabilities, then this adaptation is more difficult and there is a higher likelihood of emotional issues. So it's especially important to work with those children who are new and displaced. It would be best if we could have assistance from Ukrainian psychologists and teachers, because they know the types of issues, they know the types of social issues, and they know the types of difficulties that are typical for their educational system. They know the Ukrainian syllabus, for instance.
And even the subtleties of the schedule that a child experiences in school, the rhythms, the patterns, the rituals, also they will be different, and the child has to become accustomed in that way.
No na pewno i tutaj
that is true. It is also important to remember that the child who is displaced and is in Poland is not alone. They came here with their parents or caregivers, and we have to look at the whole situation. Oftentimes, it's the caregiver that suffered the trauma, and in that case, they're not really in position to provide adequate support to the child. So it would be best to have an organization that provides comprehensive assistance to include the parent or caregiver, and also realize that there is an issue and then help the child.
That's such a great observation. You have to have a holistic approach, but I'd like to ask you also about your people who are volunteering, how this is affecting them, because the person who is treating somebody who is traumatized are also themselves traumatized, and they also need support of the community. How do you ensure that the energy stays up and stays positive, that people don't get exhausted as they are trying their best to help those who are traumatized, that they are not traumatized themselves?
To znaczy tak, u nas zawsze
At the association, we have a psychologist that provides assistance to the volunteers on open door. This is an open door policy, so they can come to visit anytime to seek help, but also to talk, just to talk. On top of that, we support one another. We have weekly meetings on Wednesdays when we basically talk about current issues, but this is always open to discussing problems and difficulties. So these meetings also serve as a way to provide support to one another. We form a community and we care about one another, but we don't necessarily know one another that well. Not everybody knows everybody, so there is the need for a network, and if something comes up, one person could encourage another to either attend a workshop or meet a psychologist, or myself, because even though I'm not a psychologist myself, I play a role of the person who tries to uplift everybody.
Well, as we each try to change the world, right, we are acquiring new skills, and we're finding within ourselves capabilities that might not have a label, might not have a pedigree, might not have a degree, but in a sense, we can all take our own human empathy, our own human heart, and we can share that with someone else, and we can become healers ourselves. It seems that that is what you are doing.
Tak, no dla mnie to jest też
This is we are an association of people who have this in them of always learning and gaining new experiences. We keep developing all our lives and training. I myself do that. I keep learning, I keep attending trainings, but generally we can say that we are such a bunch: psychologists, teachers. We learn to keep ourselves motivated. So the way it works for us is that very easy, it's very quick to apply what we learn. So we learn, we apply, we observe, and basically talking about observing things, this whole initiative really started with us observing the situation. We decided that things were not ideal, we could help, we could change, we could do something good. And as we develop this work, we see that perhaps there's a need to create something new, to develop a new plan for a more large scale action, because what we do is we provided fragmented bits in the areas of psychology, education, medicine. It would be nice to have a comprehensive plan for these.
So as you started this service, you drew from your own experiences and you also responded to human need. But to sustain this, you have to, at a certain point, figure out a way to professionalize it and particularly earn an income in doing it. Talk about the needs that you have currently and where you see this going in the future so that we can all help you to transition to that more professional stance that you indicated previously was desired.
Przede wszystkim chcieliśmy
what we would like to change or improve is to increase the number of specializations or specialists that we have, especially in those areas where free of charge support is not available or difficult to get. For instance, some things that are not easy to acquire under the National Health Fund or within the educational system. One of such areas is psychiatry. And we would like to create a location which would be a point for comprehensive assistance. This would be a place where the assistance would begin and go throughout its course until completion. So we know that each action that we do means that we want more. We work with children from Ukraine. We have good results. Kids are happy. Parents come to see us. And we think that what would be necessary at the end of the day would be to create physical locations, because at the moment, what happens is that we go to them. So we go to places where there are a lot of refugees, for instance, the reception points. But as these disperse, we would want to have a place where they can go. Especially when somebody needs a diagnosis. What we have quite a lot of people that come and want to work for us, but a lot of them would like to work for us as a job. So that's where there would be a financial needs, because we will have volunteers and there will be some work that will be done by volunteers, but the more we work, the more needs we see that need to be fulfilled. So if we had some financial support, we would probably want to develop just that, locations which would provide comprehensive assistance, starting with Warsaw, because this is where we are based, and then other large cities.
So part of what you're arguing for is that in addition to thinking about this in terms of material, whether it's material that helps the Ukrainians retain their country, meaning in this particular case, weapons of various sorts, or logistics, cars, trucks, and so on and so forth. What you're talking about is support of people, which is not usually associated with a struggle, but absolutely should be. So there is an investment that's required. There's money that is required to meet the human need. And that's something that we really all can do. We can all talk about. So as you're thinking about this, let's talk about the transformations that you'd like to take next. I'll ask the next part of the question in a second, Jan. So you mentioned a couple of needs. The first need that you mentioned was some sort of an intake center, some sort of a physical facility that where your people can gather and where you can receive those needing treatment. Is that going to be the most effective way, given the fact, as you also said, people are dispersed, so they won't necessarily be concentrated? Is it a combination of things, so that, you know, in a center like Warsaw, there might be a physical location, but then in other places where people are more dispersed, you have another model for treatment that does not require a physical center?
So the first part of my answer is this. Yes, I do agree. Yes, that's true. Well, the basic assistance needs to be provided wherever those persons are. But here we're talking about roof over their heads and the daily things, the clothes, also help sent to Ukraine, including logistics. But the important thing is that psychological trauma is something that it does not have to be manifested immediately. Sometimes it manifests itself after some time. And in addition to that, so we can have a person who's doing fine somewhere and suddenly their condition deteriorates. Also, we have to remember that even if the situation in Ukraine is resolved and a lot of people go back, some of them will stay, perhaps some of them will stay forever. So we have to keep in mind that we need a permanent way of looking after them. But there is more. As to the second part of what you said, at the moment, it is a good idea to focus on big cities because there are the largest groupings of refugees there. But one of the tasks of those centers would be to develop a method, because we are new to all this. We never had so many refugees. We are learning how to cope with it. We don't have a methodology. We don't have a system. We could develop certain paradigms, templates, the ways to deal with various types of issues. And one of the roles of those centers would be to teach people who would then go to the smaller centers and spread the best practices. So they would go to the smaller towns, and that way we could also test those systems and get feedback from there, because I think there may be differences in how integration goes in big cities and how integration goes in small towns. So we need to have that. So this would be a way to disperse, as it were, the assistance, keeping in mind that often in the small towns, certain specializations, certain types of assistance are not available at all at the moment.
And is technology enabling that kind of support to dispersed people? Is that part of your plan as well? Poland, of course, has some great technological capabilities, and you have a huge and very vital technology sector. Is that part of your picture?
Ja myślę, że tak.
Yes, that is true. Once we have a plan, technology would provide support for its dissemination, for its communication. There are existing systems that support such activities. There are various types of platforms for all kinds of purposes that are being created right now. For instance, platforms that match people who are looking for the jobs with people who are looking for persons to employ. There are such platforms for people who are looking for transport and people who are offering transport, and this is good. And this sort of global synchronization of efforts that technology allows will not solve our problems, but will definitely support finding a solution. We also would. Technology could also be used to communicate with other centers, because we are probably not communicating as well as we could or we should. And there are other areas where people are facing similar problems to us and probably finding their own solutions. This is where technology could also help.
Often you have people who are not part of the vast majority who are left behind in times like these. So let's continue to talk a little bit more about the kind of special needs that you deal with. And you had talked before the show a little bit, before we started recording, a little bit about people who are on the spectrum of autism and other conditions. Could you just describe the range of special needs that you're dealing with, and also the competencies that you bring to the table in order to help those people with those special needs?
The children with special needs, but in particular children with either difficulties in adapting or children on the autism spectrum, their main problem is that they find it difficult to cope with change. And the way usually they're treated is that they're taught routines and they're used to things not changing. Suddenly they're in a situation where they're completely uprooted, and this causes a problem for the child, it causes the problem for the caregiver, but it also can cause difficulties for the other children in the group, in the class. So there's a point of difficulty here because of the refugee situation. They often left home without any medical documentation. So anything that we can learn is from talking to the child, observing the child, talking to the caregiver. Based on that, we can then provide advice and assistance. We can, for instance, explain to the caregiver how they can help the child, but also we can help the caregiver to provide advice of how they can get assistance from the system. Because it's a system they don't know, and we tell them what's available. Also, if we can't cope with the situation, we can provide referral, and together we can look for solutions.
How do you deal with the linguistic problems? In this particular case, we have the services of Yuyan as a translator. How do you deal with that? Because I'm sure that there are people who are bilingual, but certainly not enough given the need.
No korzystamy właśnie.
We luckily have quite a lot of volunteers who are from Ukraine and spent a lot of time in Poland. So we try to make sure that when there is something more difficult, like a conversation with a psychologist, that there is a voluntary. But for simple daily things, we do it with our own resources. We use a translator. I quickly asked this, does it mean technology? Yes, we use Google Translate in many cases where we can't have a volunteer. What would be best is to have like a permanent full-time translator that we could always use. But for other things, when we can't get an volunteer who is bilingual or close to bilingual, then we use technology. If it's something simple, if it's a simple poster. Also, we needed to translate the personal data law into Ukrainian, and the way we did that is we ran it through Google Translate, and then we asked a person to correct it, and it turned out that their machine translation was actually better than it used to be. So it required some corrections, but these things improve. However, there are certain areas where we would really need a professional interpreter there, especially somebody who knows Polish very well, because for a discussion, psychological therapy, yeah, that would help.
Is there any final point that you would like to make that I have not been smart enough to ask?
Nie, to znaczy.
I think that well, that it's just that we could talk for a very long time about educators, psychologists, especially because what we are facing is new to us, and there is a lot to say. But there's just one thing, is that we should probably pay more attention to children, people of special needs, because this was actually what we did before the refugee crisis. And when we think about the refugees who come here, they did not only have to leave the things behind, their homes behind, but often they have some difficulties and they brought them with them. So what happens is that there were perhaps some among the many children who came, some children who had special needs back in Ukraine, and maybe they were in therapy. Maybe that therapy was interrupted, and if so, there is likely to be some regression in their condition. So this is where we need to. Perhaps it's not publicized enough that in addition to the very urgent needs that have to be met, there are also those needs that people who come are of all kinds, and they include those that need extra help.
President of the Association Your Place, a group of volunteers who have educators, psychologists who are treating so many Ukrainian refugees, and those are displaced, who are helping children with special needs try to integrate and adopt. Thank you so much for sharing your experience with us. And please thank your volunteers, your staffs, your colleagues, and even your clients and your other supporters. You are doing our work in this world, and we very much are benefiting from it. Thank you so much.
Bardzo dziękuję również.
Thank you very much for the meeting.
Thank you. Have a great day. Take care.